Hello and welcome to our monthly Facebook Live class. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Natasha Daniels and I am a child therapist. I specialize in anxiety and OCD, and I'm the creator of this amazing Facebook group that has grown crazy big in the last 6 months. So today I'm going to talk to you about sensory-based anxiety. A lot of us have kids who have not only anxiety and OCD, but we have kids who have some sensory issues as well. And that's not surprising. That is because sensory issues are often a comorbid condition with anxiety or OCD. So they all kind of like to hang out together, and it's not surprising that our kids are struggling with that. So I want to go into how you handle that, but I want to talk about how you handle that very differently than the other anxiety and OCD issues that are going on in your house. Because a lot of times I will hear in this group or with the parents I work with in my practice, I will hear parents talking about approaching sensory-related and sensory-based anxiety the exact same way that I teach them how to cope with anxiety and OCD. And it's not how you should approach it. So I want to get into that, and I want to talk about the differences so that you can help your kids with the anxiety or the OCD in the way that we always talk about, and you can have some new and different approaches for the sensory-related issues. Also, a lot of times as parents, we get some OCD issues and sensory issues confused. And so I think that could be a good discussion too about what is actually like just right OCD and what is actually sensory. And sometimes it's a little bit of both. And that's a really important topic that we can talk about as well. So welcome Blanca, Stacy, thanks for coming, and Pamela. For those of you, as I wait to get people because Facebook is always super slow. Stacy said, thanks for doing this episode. Yeah, this is a really good one. And it's funny because I was going to do this episode, I was going to do this monthly class last week because I'm actually not doing it at the time that I normally do it. I normally do our week, it's not weekly, it's our monthly class the last Wednesday of every month. So, and I'm very organized, so you can really mark your calendar and you will see that the last Wednesday of every single month, I'm in here doing a Facebook Live, typically in the morning. But I tried to do it, I was away the last week of last month, and then I tried to do it last week, and like the internet broke, like literally. So Facebook wasn't working. So I am doing it today. So I want you to know that in August, our monthly class will be the last Wednesday. And what I'm going to be doing from now on, and I'm just going to give you a little update on the Facebook group before I get started as people are coming in, but I'm going to be polling you and asking you what topics you want me to talk about in these monthly classes, because I want them to be really relevant. I don't want to just pick a topic and then it may not be relevant to what you need. So look for those polls the last week of every month, and I hope that you join me because these are really great free resources to come in here and get a class where you can talk to me and get some advice. So super helpful, hopefully. The other thing that's kind of ironic is that this week is the SuperE Sensory Bundle. And so I left a link above. It's you guys actually voted on this topic, and this is the topic that you guys picked to talk about. And it's good timing because for those of you that don't know, the SuperE Sensory Bundle is once a year, and sensory experts around the internet, we all get together and we give our best products at a ridiculous price. And so this year it's all brand new stuff. It's like $1,300 worth of books and resources and online classes and like crazy stuff, and it's only $39. And so people participate because it's actually a really good way to get you in front of other people. So I participate, and I have a mini course in there on sensory-related anxiety. And I do it because it's nice to get other people who don't know me to know about my work, and that's, I think, what other people do as well. But for you guys, the bonus is that you get like all these crazy resources. There's classes in there that are like $99. And you get all of that just for $39. But it's only for this week, so there's a link above if you want to check that out. Okay, but let's get started talking about sensory-related anxiety. So I do have some questions that you guys left, and I will touch on those. But if you have questions as you are listening, please pipe in as well. So the biggest issue is that a lot of times our kids who have anxiety and OCD will also have some sensory stuff. So they might have sensory issues around their clothes. They might have sensory issues around eating. They might have sensory issues around noise. They may not have sensory processing disorder, but they will have, and they could, a lot of us do. My oldest daughter, who's 15 now, she has SPD and she has social anxiety. And really the sensory stuff was the first stuff I dealt with. She had some anxiety, but really the sensory things were like the biggest issues from like 0 to 7. And then as she got older, the anxiety stuff started to happen. And how I handle her sensory needs versus her anxiety needs are completely different. So when we talk about anxiety, we want our kids, an OCD, we want our kids to habituate. We want our kids to lean into their anxiety or OCD. So a lot of times you'll hear me talking, or maybe your therapist talking about, doing challenges or exposures, facing our fears, moving towards it. And the idea is that if I sit with my discomfort long enough, I will habituate to it and it will go away. And it's super effective. It's actually amazing to see as a mom and a therapist when my kids are doing exposures, or when the kids I'm working with in my practice are doing exposures, and I'm noticing, that they're getting used to it, that they're sitting there and they're kind of like, this doesn't bother me anymore. So I'm telling you that because it's important, because a lot of times we apply that to sensory. And sensory issues are physiologically completely different. And if they are purely sensory based, they're not going to necessarily habituate to it. They're not going to desensitize to it. And so the coping mechanisms we want to give kids with sensory issues is completely different. So we want to teach them how to differentiate between sensory, anxiety, and OCD. And so I always start with kids by explaining, and I do this for anxiety and OCD as well. I want to explain what is anxiety, what is OCD, and how a lot of kids with anxiety and OCD also have sensory issues. And I like to make it an uplifting thing. So when I talk about anxiety, I talk about their superpowers too, that they're completely empathetic and they're kind-hearted, and there's really good things that come with anxiety and OCD. Also with sensory, there's some good things that come with it, that they're sensitive inside and out. They just have to learn how to manage it. And so I did a kid's YouTube video on how to explain sensory issues to kids. And I made all these notes and I had all these links, and then I leaned on the delete button and I deleted everything. And it was already like 11 o'clock and I looked at my notes and they were all deleted. And so that was really annoying. So I can go back and link my sensory YouTube video, or if anyone happens to know it or can go to YouTube and link it here, that would be really helpful, because that's the first step. The first step is, how often do we tell our kids what sensory is? A lot of times we'll explain anxiety, we'll explain OCD, but how often do we say, look, you have supersonic skin, or you have a superpower tongue. Your nose is unreal. You can smell things like a mile away. And so we want to first explain that. So why are your socks bumpy and they're bothering you, but everybody else is putting their socks on and they're not having an issue? That can be really upsetting. It can be really confusing to kids because they feel different and they feel frustrated. And sometimes parentally, we might even negate that. We might say stuff like, just get it on and you'll get used to it. Or what's wrong with this? Look how loose it is. Why do you think this is tight on you? Or, I can't even taste the lemon in this. What are you talking about? And when we do that, we inadvertently kind of devalue what they're experiencing, because anxious kids who have sensory issues are feeling these things, and they are physiologically really experiencing that noise is really loud to them. That bump is really big to them. That tag is really itchy to them. It's not in their head, it's in their body. And I think that's a really important thing to be aware of parentally, if you don't get that. Oh, thank you, Lynn. You are so awesome. She linked the YouTube video. So definitely go to that afterwards and look at it first. I always say, watch my videos yourself before, to make sure that you feel like they're appropriate for your kids. That would be a really good video to start with, because I'm very uplifting in the video, but I explain to kids, because we want our kids, part of why kids get anxious about sensory issues is because they don't know how to manage it. And so it is about the startle effect. It is about the unpredictability. And so a lot of times you will see kids who have anxiety and sensory. And I did do a whole podcast on the chicken or the egg thing, like how to know what is purely sensory-based anxiety and what is anxiety and sensory, because they are different. And maybe I'll go into that in a second. But we want our kids to really understand all of their issues in a positive way so that they can be the best advocate for themselves. Because when our kids are their own expert, they know, hey, this is my OCD showing up. Hey, this is my anxiety showing up. Hey, I'm going to this party, my sensory issues are going to show up. And not as a sad thing, but as a way to prepare. And you can even start teaching your kids as young as like 4 and 5 about their issues in a positive way, that we're teaching them how to manage it. So like with my 15-year-old, when she was really little, most of her anxiety was sensory-based anxiety. So I'll go into that. And it's really not rocket science. I think sometimes it's just presenting it in a way that can make sense, and maybe that you haven't looked at before. Maybe you have. But if I'm afraid of the dark, or if I'm afraid of throwing up, or I'm afraid of separating from you, those are classic anxiety symptoms. Or if I have OCD and I am afraid of being a bad person, or I'm afraid of having things uneven, that's a pure OCD issue. But if I'm afraid of loud noises, and so I'm avoiding going to parties, I'm avoiding, public bathrooms, or I'm afraid of getting dressed in the morning because I'm afraid of all the sensory overload I'm going to feel with all my clothes. And so I'm refusing to go to school, and I'm anxious to go to school, but I'm mainly anxious to go to school because I don't want to get dressed, or I don't know if my hair is going to feel good. That's sensory-based anxiety. So the anxiety is being caused by the sensory issues, because having sensory issues in and of itself is completely anxiety producing. If my world is sensory overload all of the time, that is anxiety producing. And so I think that's where we get confused, because a lot of times I can have SPD, or I can have sensory issues, and all my anxiety is based on my sensory issues. So fix my sensory issues in the sense that you give me coping mechanisms and you teach me how to manage it, and my anxiety is going to go down. Now, if life was easy, it would just be that clear, but unfortunately it's not. And so most of us, if you're in my group here, most of us have kids who have both. If you're watching this, either you don't have a kid with sensory issues, just anxiety and OCD, and then you're probably not interested in this topic, or if you're here, you have a kid who probably has both. And so like I have kids who have both anxiety and OCD, totally separate, not related, right? Afraid I'm going to throw up, afraid I'm going to have an accident, afraid of bad guys, all that kind of stuff. Plus, oh my gosh, what is that smell? Or, oh my goodness, this underwear is just too tight, or these socks don't fit. Now, unfortunately, they feed into each other. So when I have a child who is in the throes of anxiety, the sensory issues are going to get higher too. And that's unfortunate. So if my daughter, my Miss 7, she doesn't have sensory processing disorder, she has some sensory issues. So her socks don't feel good, her underwear doesn't feel good, and she's got a supersonic nose. Those are her main issues. Oh, and her hearing. I don't know how I could even forget that. Sound really bothers her. So we have vibes that we plug into her ears. Movie theaters, this is a good example. She wouldn't want to go to the movie theater. And when I started to dig in and say, what's the core fear? What's the worst part about going to the movie theater? She would say to me, the sound. And once I fixed the sound, there were other issues that were unrelated to the sensory issue. I don't want to pee, it's totally random. I don't want to throw up, social anxiety. So it was both, right? And so you want to be able to tap into both of those anxieties. So for the social anxiety component, I'm going to have her face her fears. I'm going to have her do exposures or challenges and talk about how we don't care what people think. I might even have her do stuff that's embarrassing on purpose so that she can learn how to cope with it over time. Now, noise-wise, I'm not going to expose her to louder and louder noises. Let's go to movies that are super loud. No, I'm going to give her earplugs, and I'm going to teach her that to bring them wherever we go, and when she feels overwhelmed, to articulate that, to say, hey, I'm worried about the noise, and I'm going to give her vibes, and she's going to put them in, and she's going to feel better. So that's the important part, is treating those differently. And I think that's where sometimes we go wrong, is that we treat them the same. And so we want to give our kids coping mechanisms for the sensory, and we want to get them to lean into the anxiety and OCD. And so like with my oldest, who's 15, I often talk to her. She's self-sufficient. So she's a really good example of what your kids can look like when they're older. So when she was 2 and 3, she was so severe that she had occupational therapy, she had feeding therapy, she was failure to thrive because she would not put anything in her mouth. She was dropping off the weight scale to the point where I was worried we were going to have to G-tube her. She couldn't really wear clothes. She could just wear cotton dresses. Shoes were an impossibility. She only wore Crocs. And so I'm sure many of you can totally relate to that. So that's where she was at 0 to 4. Food was probably her biggest issue. I literally thought she would probably never eat. I thought she would eat a strange diet, a sensory weird diet, or maybe even a liquid diet for the rest of her life. You know, that's in my darkest moments, that's what I thought. But she did much better. I talked to her about her nose. We talked about Mr. Sensory and how it made her feel, itchy. And we talked about which foods upset her. It was the chewy ones that wouldn't disappear in her mouth. And we talked about different foods. And so I educated her on her sensory issues. And then she became her own sensory expert. She's 15, and I would say that a lot of that has gone away, but a lot of it is just her managing it. If you go to her clothes, you'll see piles of clothes still. I'm not part of it, but she does try on a lot of her clothes. She feels her clothes instead of probably looks at how they look to begin with. She eats a little weird. She eats in the front, I think, for her sensory issues. But she has found what makes her, she won't eat like casseroles and things that maybe are mixed that are a little bit too mushy, but she can eat pretty much anything now. So you train your kids how to be the best advocate for themselves. Okay, I'm going to get into some of your questions because I see some of them. And also I have tons of questions that I had on my list that I was so organized, and then I deleted like literally right before I did my Facebook Live. And so I just pulled up the thread so I can read them directly. So Heather said, I feel like you're speaking right to me. I'm glad, because I know so many of us deal with this. And Catherine said she just ordered Vibes. They are really helpful. You might feel like your child's a little resistant at first with the Vibes. My daughter was. And they don't plug out sound, they filter it. And so they can still hear, and hopefully they help your daughter. Christina said, could this be why transitions are so hard for my 3-year-old? And I think, Christina, you had a question too about how common is it for anxiety to manifest itself in aggression in 3-year-olds. Your son has language delays and sensory processing issues. You're in therapy, but the biting and hitting are out of control. And then also, I just got a comment from Jen, who I think was watching. I'm not sure if she's still here. And she said that her 2-year-old is constantly screaming about things and hitting because he gets overwhelmed. When he dances, he makes sure that he bumps into you. When he's excited or anxious, he runs and gets really loud and shoves anyone nearby. When he's upset, it's just more screaming and shoving. I can't tell. He doesn't hit or shove because he wants to hurt you. It seems like he can't help it. So those are really good examples of sensory seeking, right? So with Christina, yes, transitions can be hard for kids with anxiety and sensory issues. You see a lot of overlap with both. I find that with toddlers, you will see more sensory issues start before the anxiety. I wrote an article, like the most popular sign, I don't even know what it's called. 10, I don't remember. It's like the signs of toddler anxiety. And a lot of times I get nasty emails from people who say, you're describing sensory processing disorder. You don't know your disorders. And I'm like, no, actually, a lot of times it starts off as predominantly sensory. And then it often moves into anxiety. And so, yes, transitions are hard for kids who have anxiety and sensory issues. They are aggressive because one, anxious kids, especially with the language processing, which one of you said language processing? I think it was you, Christina. With language processing, yes, that's even a bigger issue because not only am I a toddler and I'm having sensory overload and there's always people coming at me, but I don't know how to communicate and I'm in survival mode. And so we go back to our basic, our knee-jerk reaction, which is primal, is to be aggressive. And so for your child, when they're feeling overwhelmed, yeah, it's normal. Like, oh, your hand is in my way. You're grabbing my toy. I don't have the ability to process language, and then communicate it to you. I can just quickly bite you and you can get away from me. So it's fight or flight mode in that moment. And so that's normal in the sense that it's typical behavior for toddlers in general, but it's even more typical for anxious toddlers and kids with sensory issues, and even more typical for those with processing delays because they don't have the communication. Also, with what Jen said, that's different. Your child being a ping pong ball is definitely them sensory seeking. So when you see that, you can train your child, even at 2, to say, you know what, I think maybe you need a bear hug. Or do you want a burrito? And then you roll them up. It depends on your child because sensory issues, just because we have lots of kids with sensory issues, does not mean that they're all the same. And so every child who has sensory issues has a different sensory profile. And so I could be talking about my kid and you can be like, my kid doesn't do any of that. And your kid could be totally different. You could have a sensory seeker and I can have a sensory avoider. Your kid could be hyposensitive for some things and my kid could be hypersensitive. And you could have one child who could have both. They want a lot of sensory input and then they also want to avoid. So, and I'm not an OT and I'm not a sensory expert in the sense of like sensory processing disorder. I'm a mom with kids who have sensory issues, a mom with a child who has sensory processing disorder, and I get anxiety. And because anxiety and sensory love to hang out together, I see it so often in my practice. And I will treat kids who have sensory processing disorder for the anxiety component. So, but I do want to preface that I'm not an OT. So when you have your child and you're noticing that ping pong behavior, my 9-year-old does that. And so even though I wouldn't call him, I wouldn't say that he has sensory issues, like that's not his front burner issue. When he is anxious, when he's physiologically dysregulated, he also, and he's 9, he's not 2, he will become a ping pong ball. And for him, he has learned, and you can do this with your 2-year-old, you can start to do it by labeling it. I think you need a burrito, or I think you need a bear hug, or do you want some deep pressure? You can do those things, and basically you're giving their body what they need, and so they can feel that relief without trying to seek it by bouncing into everybody, and that's really not that great. Now, my 9-year-old, he will do that himself. He will actually go into my bedroom, and he will go in between my mattress and like the board. And I'll be like, what are you doing? And he's giving himself deep pressure. He doesn't realize it, but that's what he's doing. So when I saw him doing that, because he didn't do that as a kid, I started to teach him, your body wants a hug. And so we have a beanbag, we have a pod chair, I have a sock that he can zip himself up. I bought him all these things. And when I see him starting to do that, I prompt him and I'll say, I think you need to do, like, get in your sock. Or maybe, you know what, you should go in your beanbag and give yourself a hug. And all the hyperactivity tends to settle down. So do that with your 2-year-old. You can start to label it. There are a lot of kid books on sensory issues so that you can start teaching your child. And that will really help, because if you catch it as they're starting, they're not going to do that behavior. That as they start to develop language, they might just say, bear hug. And that's really where we want them to get, where they can advocate for their own sensory needs. Because a lot of times we don't know that they're having sensory issues until we see the nasty behavior, until they explode or they turn into a puddle or they cry. And then we're kind of like, what is going on with you? And we didn't see all the subtle signs that they were having some sensory overload or anxiety or OCD, but we're not talking about that today. And so the first step is getting our kids to clue into it. And that's not with language at 2. That's with us doing things for them. Hey, that feels good every time my mom gave me a bear hug. So now I want to ask for it. And then as your son gets a little bit older, then you put the language to it as well. So hopefully that helps. I have some other questions. Melina said, how can you tell if it's sensory or OCD? For example, my 11-year-old always wants his nails cut really short. It depends. Does your child have just right OCD? Because sometimes with just right OCD, they want everything just right. And so it's a visual thing, or it has to feel even on both sides. One thing that I noticed, and I have a whole podcast episode on this that maybe somebody can link if they see it. But one thing that I noticed is when it's just right OCD or symmetry OCD, they want it to feel good on both sides. That's not sensory. If I have a sensory issue, I don't need it to be even. I just, I'm annoyed with this nail, or I'm annoyed with this bump. I'm not annoyed with I want it to be even. So I tend to look at that as a little bit more of an OCD thing. You want to look at your child's themes. So sometimes if they have just right OCD, it's not just about how it feels, it's how it looks. And so for sensory, it's not about how it looks. Typically that's not going to bother me. It's just how it feels. And so that's another way. It does get messy because a lot of kids with OCD do have the sensory component too. So you might have a mixed bag. So hopefully that helps. Let's see. Natalia said, is the anxiety the primary issue or the SPD in terms of addressing therapy? That's a really good question. I think it depends on your child. So like with my daughter, who is 15 now, her primary issue from 0 to 7 was pure sensory. I mean, sensory processing disorder all the way. And so I dealt with just the sensory issue. And now that she's older, she's 15, she's got social anxiety, that's her primary issue. And so I think it would be different depending on the child. You want to ask yourself, is the primary front burner issue all the sensory things that are causing my child's anxiety? Or is my child having a lot of anxiety plus, their socks bother them and noises bother them? So it will be different for each person. I always ask, as far as what issue to tackle, what's really impeding their daily functioning? And if it's all sensory related with a flavor of anxiety on top of it, then I'd focus on the sensory. If it's all anxiety related with a flavor of sensory, then I'd focus on the sensory. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's see. Christina said, it's definitely effective for him, just scary when it comes seemingly out of nowhere. No trigger issues. Yeah, and a lot of times the trigger is internal. So it's a physiological feeling of I need input, and so I'm about to be a ping pong ball. So I get that, and that can be really hard. And Jen said, if I pick him up during those times, he flails and it's almost impossible to hold. But if I can hold him long enough to sing to him, he relaxes. Is there any way to help him avoid getting to that place beforehand? So does he seem like he enjoys it eventually? I think that's tricky. And I'm trying to think how old. Oh, he's only 2. Yeah, I think if you can have, and it's going to sound really weird, if you can have a song, like a bear hug song that you create when you're approaching him, and then you sing it to him as you hold him, he can make that association with, it's like Pavlovian. Oh, I hear that song makes me feel good. And so there'll be less resistance. Luckily, he's only 2. And so sometimes I actually think if you get a blanket and you like burrito them and then sing this song, the flailing ends a little bit quicker because you're cocooning them and you also don't get hurt. I would only do that if your son falls into it eventually and he likes it and he relaxes. If he fights the whole time, then that's not for him, but it sounds like he does relax. And so I think coming up with a song, I use songs a lot. This isn't really what the topic is about today, but I use transition songs a lot when my kids were little. I don't do it as much now, but because kids can process singing more than they can language. And so I had a good night song, I had a bath song, I had it's time to go song. And I made them up and it was weird and my kids thought it was funny, but I would maybe have a song on like, I'm about to bear hug you. So there's some warning because he may be disoriented at the time. And also he can start to associate that song with comfort. So it's weird, but that could help. Natalia said, my son does that wedging himself. Yeah, they're looking for that deep pressure. And so you want to let them know that so that they can realize what they're doing. Because even though they're seeking it out, they won't realize it. Even my 9-year-old, when he started doing that around 7 or 8, I don't think he knew what he was doing. And I told him, your body needs a hug. You're looking for a hug. Here are the places you can get that. And so then when they're 20, they know, oh, this feeling, I need some deep pressure, because it doesn't go away necessarily. They just learn how to cope. So Christina said, plenty of times when there's a trigger, however, thank you for addressing this. Yeah, and kids are toddlers, so, and I think we don't want to forget that just because our kids have anxiety, OCD, or sensory issues doesn't mean that they're not kids, that they're going to have toddler issues where they hit, kick, and scream because, they're a toddler and they're upset, or they're 9 and they're upset. And so sometimes it's just because they're being a kid, and it can be hard to figure out when that is. All right, Karen said, and I do have questions from over here too, but I'll just go here. Karen said, hi, my 13-year-old child is finding it hard to get into school, but we're on a short timetable at the moment. But some of the lessons he will not access, as he says he has a bad stomach and he starts to panic. But last week he did different activities in school and out of school, and he coped with it quite well. But now we're back to doing lessons. He's finding it difficult getting back to lessons. School have said that there's no problem with him as he did the stuff last week. But my question is, when they have anxiety, can they do stuff or not stuff? I'm very confused. All right. Save that, Karen, for a thread in the Facebook group. I really want to stick to just sensory-based anxiety right now. So that would be a good question for the group after this. Melena said yes, but he also has sensory issues. Lisa said, I have a sensory kiddo, but I'm also teacher to special needs kiddos that are also sensory. Lots of my students don't like to help their bodies as they feel like it means something is wrong with them. I try to explain that it's okay to help our bodies and it isn't a bad thing. I should mention I work in an EBD classroom. Yeah, and that's why I made a kids YouTube video on sensory issues. I talk about kids' superpowers, and I talk about superpowers when it comes to anxiety, and I talk about it when it comes to sensory. So I think it's really about how you frame it, that we all have superpowers. With my oldest daughter, I'll be like, you can taste a drop of lemon a mile away in a recipe. You'll be like, there's lemon in this. And I'm like, no, there's not. And then I'll look and I'm like, oh my gosh, how did you taste that? And so I frame it in a good way. And sometimes when we're having dinner, my kids will be like, my superpower is noses. And so I can smell your breath like a mile away. So like, you can frame it in a positive and make it uplifting, and then just say, we don't want it to get overwhelming though. So how do we cope with it? So it's all about how we frame it. And definitely look at the YouTube video, because that's something that you can offer to your students to help. Christina said, to piggyback on that, if your child is already in OT for sensory issues, at what point do you seek out more help for behavior issues? You have a toddler, and so I would recommend looking up, I don't know where you live, but I would recommend looking up infant and toddler mental health providers. That's kind of the verbiage you want to look at, because there is early intervention in a lot of states where you will have a team of people who can come out to your home. And I don't know how that is in your state or where you live, but Arizona has that, where you would get a mental health professional, you would get an OT, you would get a PT, whatever your child needs. And so I think it's good to start with as many services as you can, because the more proactive you are, the better. Stacy said, can you use ERP with sensory issues like going to the movies or a concert? That's a really good question. The loud noise to this day is a trigger. No, I have not seen that exposures, and she's talking about exposure response prevention, which is what we use for anxiety and OCD. I have not seen exposures work because it's a different component. It's a different part of their body. It's a different physiological issue. And so they don't acclimate, they don't habituate. The noises are still they're still loud. Now that doesn't mean that you don't give them something to use to cope and then you put them back in that environment. So for instance, my 7-year-old was avoiding movie theaters. She was avoiding festivals. She was anything. And she would always ask, is it going to be loud? Is it going to be loud? And so it was turning into an anxiety, a sensory-based anxiety, where she was avoiding pretty much anything that she thought would be loud. And so I had her wear the vibes at home. I had her get used to them. And then I exposed her to the movie theater, and then to loud concerts, and then to fireworks, so that she could trust in it and know that she is okay. So that's how you would use ERP. You would give them the crutch or the coping mechanism, and then you would get them to do that activity again. Hopefully that makes sense. And Karen said he has sensory issues. That's why I ask. Okay, well, and it was hard to see with your question what part of that was sensory, where your sensory question was. So if you can reframe it, just because I don't want to read the whole thing in front of a bunch of people, that'd be really helpful. So when you have kids who are having school issues, if it's sensory related, it tends to be that, all the noises in the classroom are bothering them, or they're getting so distracted by noises, and you had ruled out ADHD, or, it's purely sensory, or they're uncomfortable sitting in the chair. You see all sensory related issues. If it's anxiety or OCD, it has more to do with, and I think I feel like you posted this question. I think I just answered it in another thread, but I'm not sure because there's so many posts. But like if your child is writing and has to rewrite and rewrite, or they're reading and they have to reread and reread, that's not sensory. That's maybe possibly OCD. And so you have to just flesh out what it is so that you can get to the core issue. Okay. Lillian says, is it typical for kids with SPD to display it mostly with their mom, their safe place? For example, hugging mom too hard or pinching mom, but no one else. Definitely. So unfortunately for moms, and it depends, sometimes dads too, but more so moms, we tend to be the target for all their struggles. And so if they have OCD and they have to ask for reassurance, they're more likely to ask the mom over and over again. If they have meltdowns because of their sensory issues, or they sensory seek, they are more likely to do that with their mom. It's just part of the deal. So yes, I see that much more often than I don't. And Natalia says she's agreed with Christina. I'm wondering if I need to seek more help. I'm iffy about our school OT. Yeah, and I think, a lot of times, and depending on your school system, I think sometimes we depend way too much on the school to fill these gaps. And I would recommend that if you can find a professional outside of school, I think that's better, because sometimes people are overwhelmed at school and they're going to be in a group setting and they're not going to get the one-to-one. There are some amazing group programs, but there also aren't. And so I think supplementing is really good. My Miss 7, she has had speech issues like forever. And everybody kept telling me it's normal, don't worry about it. And then I bothered the school, and she finally got speech therapy in school. And they're like, it's just minor. We're just fixing a couple of things. And finally over the summer, I'm like, I'm going to take her to get assessed from somebody else. And she has all of these facial issues and tongue issues that need a very specialized therapy where only one person in Arizona does it. So it's good to get outside of the school system and get your own services, and also tap into the services that you can get for free. That's my opinion. Okay, I had other questions here that I'm going to answer. Actually, okay, I answered Christina's. Kayla said, I believe my son has sensory issues on top of his anxiety. I want to know if there's anxiety-related sensory issues, or are they completely separate? I think I answered that, hopefully. I don't know if she's here, but I think that was addressed. They are different, obviously, right? We just talked about this for the last 37 minutes. So hopefully I'll tag her if she's not here and she can see that, because I feel like I addressed that pretty well. And if I didn't, leave a message and you can let me know. Lillian said, best person to diagnose SPD, psychologist or OT, suspect anxiety. Oh, you suspect anxiety too, best course of action for diagnosis. That's a really good question too. For sensory processing disorder, you definitely want to go to an occupational therapist who specializes in that. Some don't, and so I think you really want to make sure that that's an area they focus on, and you want to go there for the diagnosis. Psychologists don't diagnose sensory processing disorder. I think it's also really important to go and address the anxiety, especially if you see it separate from the sensory. If it's purely sensory-based anxiety, a really good OT who specializes in sensory processing disorder will address the anxiety, because he or she will be giving them coping mechanisms to handle their sensory issues and getting them to deal with them. And so their anxiety will go down. But if you're seeing it separate, they're anxious about things like going to bed, or they're anxious about things that are not sensory related, I think it's important to also go and get a therapist to help you with that. A lot of times people think it's one or the other, and maybe financially that's all you can do. There's plenty of resources. you can go and get an OT, and then you can do like a lot of reading and work at home. I mean, I have tons of online classes, and parents who can't access therapy for financial reasons or because there's no provider, they just take my classes online, ask me questions online, and they can do that while getting their kid OT and paying for that kind of stuff. So there are ways that you can do both in different modalities. So hopefully that helps. Lacey had a question, and she said, which game comes first, sensory issues or anxiety? I'm sure it's different for everyone. When anxiety is low, in check, sensory issues are minimal. When anxiety is running the show, sensory issues, sensitivities run rampant. Do we still treat the sensory issues or treat the anxiety as primary? So these are similar questions, and these are really good questions. Let me give you an example, and I don't think there's one comes first and one comes second. We've obviously talked a lot about that today, but let's say my child is afraid to go to school. We're all on break, so it's been really nice, but let's say, we're back at school and that's going on. And so let's say my child's afraid to go to school because they're afraid they're gonna throw up. They have emetophobia, the fear of throw up, super common, and they're freaking out because they don't wanna go to school, they're worried they're gonna throw up. And then their socks don't feel good, and they're freaking out about their socks. I'm not going to address their socks. I'm not going to go into, look, I know you have sensory issues and your socks are bothering you. So let's talk about your socks. Let's talk about how your feet are sensitive. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to address the anxiety. That's the front burner issue. I know you're afraid to go to school right now because you're afraid you're going to throw up. And I know that's really scary. And then I'm going to do all the things that I normally do for anxiety. And I'm not going to necessarily address the socks, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that they're wearing socks before they go to bed the next day, so that they don't have that issue the next day. So my point is, I wouldn't hyper focus on the sensory if the predominant issue is a fear that's causing the sensory issues to get worse. When you don't feel well, all your stuff comes up, right? So if I'm anxious or if I'm having an OCD moment, then my sensory stuff is going to be magnified. When I'm doing well, my anxiety and OCD is in check, my sensory issues might be in check as well, because I'm just doing okay. Lillian said, can delayed sleep phase disorder stem from SPD, taking 2 hours or more to fall asleep? That's such a big question. I think it could be anything. So yeah, you would maybe want to talk to a sleep specialist if it's a real big issue. Or I don't know how old your child is, Lillian, but it might be just asking your child, what's the worst part about going to sleep? When it's not anxiety, kids will say, I don't know. I just sit there and I'm not tired. Or I have to wiggle or I have to move. But you're not getting any answers that are thought related. When it's anxiety related, I get answers that are more like, well, I'm worried about tomorrow, or, well, I don't know if you're going to sleep and I want to make sure that I go to sleep before you, or I want to know that you're going to check on me and I don't know if you're going to check on me, or that shadow in my room is acting weird, or, I was thinking about something scary I saw this morning. So you get answers like that. And so I would want to find out what is taking the 2 hours. Are they coming in and out because they're nervous and so they're checking with you and so they're hyper aroused because they're anxious? Or are they just kind of like, I can't go to sleep? So I think that would require a lot more investigating. So I'm just going to make sure that I got to everyone's question. Amy asked a question. I have a couple more that were on the thread. Whenever I have a Facebook Live class I'm going to do, I will always post the topic so that you can leave a comment. So if you can't be here live, you can always watch the replay and I'll always answer your questions. So that's good for you to know for next month, because if you're new to these Facebook Live monthly classes, I want you to take advantage of them because it's just a good opportunity to get some free information. So Amy said her daughter is HSP and SPS, has social anxiety and school refusal, and a touch of OCD too, which all heightened this past year. She just turned 15. Before this year, it was minor and manageable. I'm curious if you would know why she can't get herself to school. Certain noises annoy her, yet she loves to go out to loud concerts. I would think the loud, crowded concerts would bother her too. And then Beth actually made a very intelligent comment, and she said maybe she has misophonia. And so for starters, I think it's important to know that sensory issues don't have to make sense. And so you can have a kid who likes to wear really tight clothes, but then something feels too tight. Or you can have a kid who, like Amy has, who loves concerts, but maybe there are certain sounds at home that really irritate her. Now, if there are sounds, very specific sounds, you might want to look into misophonia, because misophonia has to do with not the volume of sound, but the particular sound. And I actually have a kid's YouTube video on misophonia, and I have a couple of podcasts on it, and I actually have it myself, so I totally get it. Normally, it's sounds that have to do with the mouth, so eating, chomping, lip smacking, that kind of stuff, water dripping, nail tapping. They're very specific, and it's hitting the limbic system, and it's creating kind of a rage response. So that's something to look into as well. But I also find that kids with sensory issues as they get older learn how to adapt for the things they want to adapt to. And so like my daughter now, who's 15, she'll wear jeans. She'll wear jean shorts. That's unheard of for her. She didn't wear jeans, I think, until she became a teenager. And I think because now the coolness factor is there, I think she's willing to deal with the feeling. I mean, she always gets the super cotton ones that are really soft, but she would never have touched jeans before that. But because she's a teenager, her priorities are more important. So she's willing to kind of cope with that because she wants to wear jeans. So maybe also your daughter really wants to go to these concerts and she's coping with it. Also, for sensory issues, sometimes the startle and the unpredictability is more of the issue. And so if I know I'm going to a concert and I'm listening to this noise, I'm choosing to, I love this band, I can tolerate the sound, I'm enjoying it. But if I'm sitting there and all of a sudden I hear a loud pop, or I didn't know that the toilet was going to automatically flush, and so I get up and boom, the toilet's flushing, that's startling as well. That's overwhelming for kids with sensory issues. So sometimes it's the surprise factor too, and that's why you get the sensory-based anxiety, because I'm really anxious about these things popping up. So I want to know about the event. I want to know what's going to happen. I want to know who's there because I want to plan. And that's what we want to teach our kids. Okay, and I think Joyce had one, and I think that's the end of our question. So I'll wrap up in a second. Joyce said, how do I tell the difference between not wanting to change clothes because they feel just right to not wanting to because they make her feel emotionally comfortable, her OCD? That's hard. I would ask her, what's the worst part about changing your clothes? Because she doesn't want to change her clothes. Yeah, so I would say, what's the worst part about changing your clothes? I know I ask that for everything because I get really good answers when I ask kids, what's the worst part of? And so if she says, these are clean, and I don't want to wear dirty ones, well, that's totally OCD. If she says, these just feel so good, on my skin, and when I wear new clothes, they scratchy, well, that's pure sensory. You might get an answer in between, but really what I'm looking for is the sensation versus the thought behind it. And so that's what you want to look for. So I hope that you find these classes helpful. If you have sensory kids, like I said, the sensory bundle is kind of a gift. It's something that happens once a year for a few days. So you definitely want to check that out. I left a link. I have a mini class in there that I added. It's a $14 mini course on how to parent kids with sensory-based anxiety. And so that's in there. If you are in my AT parenting community, you get that for free already. So don't worry about that. You already have it. For those of you that don't know about my AT parenting community, it's separate from this group. It's a community, it's a membership. So you join and you participate. And I do weekly Facebook Live classes just like this, but I do them every week. And we're more of a tight-knit group because I get to really know people's issues and their names and what's going on. And they have access to me in Facebook, but also on forums. We have a website, and they also get one of my big classes for free. So I have a huge class on anxiety, and I have a huge class on how to parent kids with OCD, and I have a huge class on social anxiety, and they get one of those for free as a member. So if you're interested in that, you can go to atparentingcommunity.com. We would love to have more members. We are a really awesome group of people. But even if you don't want that, please join me next month. I love this group. I'm going to be trying to come in here more often now that I have more free time to help offer some suggestions and advice. So hopefully you'll see me around more often. But don't miss our classes. They are good, and it's free resources. If you've ever wanted to watch our old ones, go to the top of this page and you can, I link them and I leave them there. And so you can binge watch all of these Facebook Live classes on various topics to help you. So I hope that you're having a fantastic day, and I will see you again next month, but I'll see you in the group probably today. Take care.
Hi, I'm a mum of a daughter with OCD. I live in South Africa, and it's a country that doesn't have a lot of resources for children's mental health and specifically OCD. I really was at my wit's end on how I'm going to support my child, how I'm going to do ERP, how I'm just basically going to parent a daughter with OCD in a country that has little to no resources.
And at times it got just debilitating for us as a family, and I was super lonely. People weren't listening, I didn't have any support.
The AT community has been an absolute lifesaver. Natasha has been instrumental in the past few months in helping us set up ERP challenges, going through them step by step, being supportive each and every step of the way.
Joining the AT parenting community has been one of the best things I could have done for me and my family.
Natasha has built this community and it is exceptional.
I've learned so much. The support is fantastic. It's just been life-changing for my daughter.
It's so nice to be able to ask her live questions in office hours. She's there, she responds. Her live videos every week where she asks us what we need her to talk about. Also her forums, again, where you can ask questions. She's on there all the time. She is very present. The resources she's provided, the worksheets, there are so many things in this AT parenting community that are beneficial.
Natasha gives you so much of her time and her expertise. She's there to answer your questions, so it's such a personal way of getting help and support when it's much needed.
Personally, the community has helped me because I feel like I needed my support.
And then you have the added bonus of this fantastic community of parents who are going through such similar things, and suddenly you're empowered and have ways of accessing help and making a real difference to your family.
And also just the support of all the other moms and dads. It's really good. You know, we laugh together, we cry together, we fail together, we succeed together, and everybody gets it. Everybody gets it, and it's such a nice community to be with, and I hope you join us. You won't be disappointed. Try it out.